So, Jeff, there is a lot going on that I think requires a lot of scrutiny, both in terms of the anemic, maybe that's even too complimentary, response by the Trump administration to this sort of freight train that was barreling towards us in the form of a global pandemic. And then there is another element to the response that appears at first glance to be a tremendous amount of sort of monetizing the response by friends and acquaintances and perhaps the president himself. Let's just start with this. Give me a grade as to how the Democrats have been doing with their promise back in 2018 when they got elected and took control of the House. How are they doing in terms of oversight?
I think, to be generous, it's like a D minus. And if it wasn't for Maxine Waters and her committee, we might be in the F range. They have made a very conscious decision that oversight will be perceived as political. And as a result, they have made a political decision to not do oversight. And the irony seems to be lost on them that making a decision to not appear political is, in fact, the quintessential political move. And politicians are always going to be believed by voters to be political because it's kind of in the title. They're politicians. So they have been scrupulous in avoiding the perception of oversight. It took the incredible violent assault on Joe and Hunter Biden by the Trump administration to muster any serious oversight. And, of course, that very narrowly drawn impeachment, while entirely warranted, was not the type of measure that was going to generate widespread bipartisan condemnation. And the conclusion that they drew from that is that oversight is bad politics, and they kind of said as such after Trump's acquittal in the Senate. And as a result, Trump has been ever more emboldened. And the problem is that is bad enough in normal times, and amidst the pandemic and amidst the dispensation of trillions of dollars of money, it's a particularly bad time to have a president who feels that he is oversight.
I mean, we're talking on a day where in the past week he's fired unilaterally two different inspector generals when we talk about oversight. And I would say, and before we go sort of from the marker you've just set down, are they really reacting to impeachment when they say that oversight is not is not politically a net positive? I mean, let's put aside the sort of you got a job to do. And maybe
right.
The idea is you do your job and you figure out how to sell it politically rather than letting your interpretation of politics determine what your job is. But putting that aside for a moment, I mean, I look back and I think Richie Neal, who is the head of the Ways and Means Committee, he could have had access to Donald Trump's taxes 2 years ago, and he still hasn't. There's a IRS whistleblower out there somewhere. I don't know. It seems to have disappeared. And all of these decisions were made before impeachment, were they not?
Oh, yeah. I mean, their baseline assumption is that oversight was bad, and then they've only doubled down on that since impeachment failed. I think that it is true that if you ask voters leading questions about oversight, you can probably get them that voters would rather everybody get in a room and solve the nation's health care crisis. And even honestly, majorities would like to see the climate crisis solved and any number of other issues addressed on a bipartisan basis. But, many children want ponies. That doesn't mean they're going to get them. And realistically speaking, we're not going to see a bipartisan consensus emerge to fix health care in this country that involves Mitch McConnell, Donald Trump, and Nancy Pelosi. But what the Congress can do is try to make sure that the executive branch is working. And as we've all become much more familiar with the Center for Disease Control and the National Institutes of Health in the past few weeks, we should just be reminded that we probably didn't think about those agencies much in the prior years. And the basic point is that the government is pretty big for really important reasons. Like there's a part of the government that is supposed to prevent pandemics. It's really important. In fact, when it functions most effectively, we don't think about it because it prevents problems. People had stopped thinking about Ebola because the government under Obama had been competent enough to keep Ebola as a problem essentially on Africa and a problem that was solved for a period of years in Africa. So we don't think about government, but the only way to have a government that we don't need to think about is if Congress is providing oversight of it and making sure that it's effective. And that is particularly necessary when you have a president as corrupt and incompetent as Trump and a team of people around Trump like Jared Kushner and Stephen Mnuchin who are entirely untrustworthy individuals. So, yeah, they really needed to be doing oversight. And I think it turns out to be good politics on the regular. I mean, there was nothing to the Benghazi investigation except we only know about Hillary Clinton's emails because of the Benghazi investigation. So it's just so ironic that we had a not corrupt administration in Obama in which the Republicans constantly pursued oversight and reaped political rewards, and now you have a completely corrupt administration, and the Democrats won't do basic oversight of it. And in fact, they're saying explicitly, Majority Whip James Clyburn has said that they're only going to be looking prospectively with oversight. They're not going to look back on how we got into this mess. And I don't know about you, but yeah, go ahead.
Well, I want to get deeper into Clyburn's what he's been saying and how comprehensive his comments should be taken by people like us who are concerned with oversight. But I want to break this down a little bit because we have a history of Donald Trump and the Trump administration, frankly, Republicans, right? I mean, John Bolton, who is an avowed enemy of Donald Trump now, was also had a hand in doing things like firing and essentially ending the position of the top coordinator of pandemic response in the country that sat on the National Security Council. I guess the version of him that existed at the Department of Homeland Security also cut. We know from reporting that that the pandemic researcher for the CDC in China was cut. We know that the entire team of the CDC that was embedded in China to observe these things and to comment on them and to help them and to warn us was cut over the past 2 years. I mean, there's reasons. You have oversight that is necessary for, making sure that people understand who's responsible for what. There's oversight to make sure that people don't get the sense like, hey, there's no cops. I might as well just take this TV. Right. And there's oversight for just like, hey, good government. We were a victim of our own success insofar as like Ebola, or we were a victim of our lack of suffering with something like SARS or MERS. And we need to have a plan for the next president who comes in to say that, like, hey, job number one should be to reconstitute the pandemic response team that sat on the National Security Council. And if we don't have oversight and there's no report generated, there's just a couple of disparate articles in the Washington Post, we're screwed, it seems to me.
Absolutely. There can be positive political byproducts from oversight, but that should not be the purpose of it, and that's historically not been the primary purpose of it. It is, in fact, to have better governance. It's to have better governance in real time because there are cops on the beat, and it's also to learn from the acts of oversight to figure out what needs to be done in the future. And so we at Revolving Door Project should have a piece out later this week where we argue that part of the reason why the Phase 3 bill is inadequate is that because of the absence of stringent oversight of entities like the Treasury Department and the Small Business Administrator, we don't know that Congress didn't fully understand the lack of capacity at these places to help serve America's small businesses. And so the bill, which to some extent was admirable in intentions with respect to small business, is going to prove to be a failure. And that failure would have been understood and could have been addressed in advance if there had been more serious oversight of the executive branch. And this also goes to the ability of a potential Biden administration to make realistic plans for the future. We need Congress to begin to figure out what's going on in these different agencies and departments of the executive branch, to figure out how much expertise has been rotted out, how many scientists have fled an anti-science administration, and what we need to do to replace them and expand expertise of the federal government. We need to start learning that now so that a potential new administration can hit the ground running, and so that additional legislation addressing the pandemic can be written against the backdrop of actually understanding what is the federal government capable of doing, what capacity needs to be built by legislation. We just need more facts and more understanding to write good laws, or for a potential Biden administration to make coherent plans. And right now, they're not doing the spade work necessary to produce good results in the future.
Well, all right. So let's start with this then, because I want to get to what needs to be happening. I want to get I want to get fairly specific with it. But what is happening now? Clyburn came out and he said that they're going to, I guess, say like, oh, we're going to be a cop on the beat going forward. Is that right? Now, clarify for me what your understanding is of Clyburn's committee, and which committee is that? The Government Oversight Committee, I guess. What their jurisdiction is, as you know it, in terms of their mission, and what's going to be involved in it. I mean, it just seemed, and is his going to be the only commission that is like sort of involved in this oversight, or is he just saying like, my specific commission is just going to be moving forward? There'll be others that are, looking back.
So there are normally pre-coronavirus, there are 26 committees that the House of Representatives is involved in. 6 of them are select committees on various issues, including intelligence, which is what was the key committee on the Ukrainian-related impeachment. 19 of them are specific standing committees, so those are the ones in charge of particular areas. So there's an agriculture committee, and they look over the Department of Agriculture. And there's the Ways and Means Committee, which you alluded to earlier with Chairman Richie Neal, that is in charge of taxes and Medicare and the like. So there are 19 of those committees that have subject matter jurisdiction that's written into the rules of the House of Representatives. And then there's a 20th standing committee called the Oversight Committee, which can look across everything. The new committee that Pelosi and Clyburn have announced has not actually yet been voted on. It would have to be added to the House rules, which the majority can do whatever they want. That's not exactly a heavy lift, but it's not actually happened because one of the big problems with the way Pelosi is running the House is that she's not implemented any sort of remote voting procedures. So the House of Representatives right now is kind of like Wisconsin in terms of, to vote, we're going to have to vote in person and risk a lot of people's lives. So that seems to me not right. But so there's a lack
do you
of
think,
clarity
let me ask you
what
this, Jeff.
committee
Do you think that is by design?
I sadly do. I hate to be this skeptical, and I don't think it's the most skeptical in terms of the way you might see it, the most angry people on Twitter asserting this is about corporate interests or what have you. I do think that deal-making between leaders and a reliance on unanimous consent in the House of Representatives is a mechanism that strengthens the leadership of the House, and it's essentially a whipping mechanism to prevent progressive revolt in her ranks. I definitely think that the House not having robust procedures in place to operate remotely, which includes formal committee hearings. There are some differences in committee rules, and so I hesitate to speak completely universally. But for the most part, committee hearings are not occurring at all, and that's insane. That doesn't mean committee work is not happening at all. There are paid staff who are working as hard as they can from their homes. Work is happening, but there are not formal committee hearings, even as so much of the rest of white-collar America has adjusted to Zoom and other teleconferencing services. And this is, I think it allows all power to inhere to the Speaker of the House. And the House of Representatives is no longer an unruly institution. It is really an edifice entirely controlled by Pelosi. And so I think she thinks she's a more prudent guide than the unruliness of her broader coalition. And so I think preventing remote voting serves her interests, which I don't think are malevolent. I disagree with a lot of them. I'm not imputing anything malevolent to her. I think she's a patriot, but she's a patriot who's accumulating power. And so I think
she's accumulating power, and she also feels quite strongly that the way to succeed is to just simply, four corners this, it seems to me, which is a reference, to college basketball. And we're just going to kill time because Donald Trump is messing this up in many respects. And they just think that if we get involved in this, we risk, changing the subject from his failures. But that to me seems ridiculous. I mean, I can understand having those concerns, but there could be a way to approach those concerns and to continue to do oversight and set yourself up to deal with these things, right? That's my take on this, is that there's just sort of like a lack of boldness, a lack of confidence, and it's like to stretch the sports metaphor, when you play not to lose, very often you lose.
Yeah, I'm totally with you on your prevent defense and four corners references. In fact, it's kind of like going to the four corners after the NCAA finally instituted a shot clock. It's an antiquated approach that makes more sense in a 1990s mediascape than today.
Yes.
It forgets how quickly tides can turn, and that a lot of American voters have the memory of, insert your metaphor there, but they do not have long memories. And but there's a preference for passive approaches, this notion of avoiding mistakes rather than actually just taking initiative. And I just feel more comfortable in politics trying to take the initiative, and I just don't see that being Pelosi's approach. And yeah, if you believe political science models that you can input economic data and output political results, then Biden is guaranteed to win in a landslide in 2020. If you think American politics is more complicated than a mathematical model.
So isn't Hillary Clinton, by the way, in 2016.
Yeah. These models are deeply imperfect, but they tend to give an exaggerated sense of certainty, which actually, it's ironic because Nate Silver himself, his writing is very clear about the uncertainties of his models. But I feel like Pelosi is only getting half of the information out from this consensus that, it's obvious that Trump has screwed this up, which true, but that as a result, Democrats are going to benefit. And I just think, it's 7 months until the election. There are lots of shenanigans that can happen with respect to the election, as we are witnessing tragically in Wisconsin today. And I just don't have that degree of confidence. And I'd rather try to use the powers of the House of Representatives on behalf of the American people, rather than just hoping all things kind of proceed to a victory without doing very much in the next 7 months.
I guess I am just slightly more cynical, because I think it's both a temerity and an overconfidence about, all we need to do is just watch him hang himself. But I also do think that there's this element of control. And that control is not just for the sake of control, but it's a concern that things are going to spin in different directions, and that there may be political movements that come out of these things that might be harder to control. Like, for instance, if Nancy Pelosi thought that the oversight of contracting was a broad socialization of things, or if there was a sense of like, well, all these people have lost health insurance, and the answer is actually more Obamacare, let's say, or I think if there was a guarantee that that would be the outcome, I think there would be less concern. I think there's also sort of like when we talk about control, it's a control and the concern that there might be political outcomes that we don't like from this. And so, all right, let me ask you this. 3 committees. If you, Jeff, and I am willing to the extent that, I mean, I have no vote within the Democratic caucus of the House, but if I'm in a position to get one and to nominate someone as the Speaker of the House, I'm going to nominate you. And I'm going to do so based upon the 3 things that you would do, the top 3 things that you would do in terms of oversight going forward. What are they, Jeff? You're almost guaranteed locked to get my vote, but it's not that valuable.
I would empower the House Financial Services Committee, which does have the one really aggressive and excellent chair in Maxine Waters. But I would give her all of the staffing resources. And by the way, they've not actually voted the House the additional resources that are needed to provide oversight to the radically expanded executive branch, which is a huge mistake. But I would give her team the resources necessary to really have a permanent oversight of the Trump stimulus, because so much of it is going to get run through the Treasury Department and the Federal Reserve, which are within their jurisdiction. And we really need to follow the money, and we really need to empower whistleblowers in those departments to feel comfortable that an entity, the House Financial Services Committee, which is not going anywhere, is going to have my back if I come forward and tell my tale of corruption and incompetence. Because I think those stories are there to be told. They need to be told. We need to learn what is and is not working, and we need those cops on the beat. The Energy and Commerce Committee has power over healthcare, and as you alluded to, I think when you have the federal government basically paying for such a large chunk of all economic activity in the country, this is kind of the opportunity to do things like socializing chunks of medicine that are otherwise the political economy is almost impossible. But there are a lot of entities which only are going concerns because they're going to be fed tons of money by the federal government. And you could use that to neuter the political economy forces which otherwise stand in the place of getting health insurance to all Americans. You'd like to see an Energy and Commerce Committee monitor the response to coronavirus, monitor the implications for other health care, because obviously it's a terrible time to be a cancer patient, or even like to have a busted up knee or something in New York City or across the country. We really need aggressive figuring out what went wrong and why our for-profit system, which costs nearly 20% of the overall gross domestic product of the country, doesn't have enough ICU beds in case of a pandemic, which Steven Soderbergh knew was coming 10 years ago, but the healthcare industry in this country seems not to have been prepared for. And then third and foremost, I would want to empower the Oversight Committee. Elijah Cummings was a tragic loss, and I think the fact that we don't really have a serious figure doing oversight. Carolyn Maloney is a nice enough member of Congress, but she's no Elijah Cummings. She's no Henry Waxman. We need a House Oversight Committee that inspires fear, that can take over the nation's media ecosystem and draw attention to issues. There are going to be problems across the entire government. The House Oversight Committee has the ability to go in and out of every aspect of the federal government and basically the entire economy and root out corruption. It's a huge, almost impossible mandate. You need larger-than-life figures who are willing to take risks and go where the truth leads them. And I've not felt the House Oversight Committee's imprimatur the last 18 months or so.
Jeff Hauser, founder and director of the Revolving Door Project. Thanks so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
It was a pleasure.